Welcome to Chinwags and the OCC. In our first episode, I have a question for our three gentlemen here. We have all been reading about the Farage case. News channels have sensationalized it, and social media has made it worse. I'm utterly confused, and I'd like to ask the OCCs to explain to me and help me form my own opinion and understand how this may impact our work as compliance professionals. Who would like to start first?
Mark has seen the documents from the bank upon which the decision was made. We can't release those documents because the extent to which they're authorized for release is not yet clear. But Mark has got some very clear information from those documents as to exactly why the bank made the decision it made. And it's not the reasons that are generally in the media.
Thank you for that, Nigel. The information that I've received is the actual result of a lawyer-led subject access request to Coutts, which was then subsequently published in the Daily Telegraph and on Nigel Farage's Twitter account. So if you want to have a look at 40 pages of badly written fiction, I suggest you start with that. The problem I have is that most normal people will look at a bank and say, as a privately owned institution, it has the right to make up its mind who it banks with and who it does not. And normally, I would tend to fall into that side of the opinion. However, the NatWest Coutts Group is slightly different. It's still 39% owned by Her Majesty's government. After the last time Royal Bank of Scotland decided they were going to rule the world and then imploded spectacularly. And they have undertaken a specific review of Nigel Farage as a politically exposed person. All of this, so far, so good. The issue for me is in what it wrote was a tissue of unmitigated gossip without any substantive consideration of the sources of information and what they were trying to achieve. They then made the mistake of misleading the markets as to why they tried to exit Nigel Farage. And so before I start boring for Britain on this subject, let me hand it back to Des and to Nigel for their reactions on what I'm saying. And am I being wholly unreasonable? Am I misleading Julia? Or am I, as I always like to think so, right?
Des?
Well, that's quite interesting, Mark. I mean, the whole episode felt to me that it felt like virtue signaling and based on a very fuzzy concept of financial institutions becoming the moral police. It follows on. There is a precedent here because I talk about events that happened, PayPal blocking the crowdfunding sites for detained protesters, of the January 6th riots in Washington, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoking an act against the truck drivers in the antiviral virus uprising. For me, again, as I said before, it's two questions that I kind of have. One would be, are they judging the ethics and values of all of their customer base in the same way? Because it does feel to me that there's a lot of woke smoke and mirrors involved here in the Farage fiasco, as I like to call it, because it runs off the tongue quite well. It's interesting that the apology that Coutts provided up until only a few hours ago did not result in the reversal of the decision. Although I'm told that in this morning, Farage is claiming that they have offered to reverse this, which again is very, very strange. The way it's been looked at in the media, for me, is very much in this consideration that all financial institutions should give a good reason why they're looking to offboard anybody. And I kind of consider how far this can go. The extreme for me, and it's a question for Julia that I won't expect an answer today from, but your company, HugoSave, if you consider the other end of this Farage fiasco, what if your card users and your clients used your cards to buy trainers? Are you worried about the Nike relationship ethics or animal welfare issues, or the Kanye West relationship with Adidas? How far does this go? Possibly that's a question that's I'd like to leave. I'll pass it over to Nigel for your thoughts.
I have a very brutalistic approach to this. I firmly believe that every business should have the right to do business with absolutely anybody it chooses to, and absolutely nobody if it chooses not to. And I don't think that moral, political, or any other discriminatory factor should be taken into account, because at the end of the day, it is their business. What troubles me, though, is that we're not in that world. We don't have that ideal. We don't have the right to say, I'm not going to deal with you because you're a person I don't like, or I disagree with your views. Are we going to take the view attributed wrongly to Voltaire that I defend, I don't agree with your views, but I will defend to the end your right to hold them? I mean, it's all very noble, but at the end of the day, there are people who do things that we as individuals don't like. The difficulty we have here is that the decisions are not in the Farage case were not made, as is often being put forwards in the media, in the financial media. This was not because he was a politically exposed person. This was because, not to put too fine a point on it, he's a bit of a dick. Are we going to say we're not going to allow people who are outspoken on subjects we don't like to be ostracized by financial institutions? Now, if we go back to this right at the very beginning, there's very little reason to use Coutts at all. Coutts is pompous, pretentious, and expensive. And it will have taken on Farage because he was famous. Because that's the type of customer Coutts likes to take on. Farage will have gone there because he's gung-ho for Britain, and Coutts is very famously the Queen's bankers. I don't know whether it's the King's bankers, but it's the Queen's bankers. And so there was a circle there of ego on both sides. Somebody at Coutts has decided that his outspokenness, regardless of the subject, does not meet their ego anymore. And that's at the heart of it. This is not de-risking. It's not even a moral perspective. It's just somebody deciding we've had enough of this chap and his politics are not aligned with ours. I disagree with that as a reason to get rid of somebody.
Julia, if I could be slightly controversial for a second, I'm going to put it slightly worse than that. The banks, for anybody who's entered the financial service sector after 2008, we have been in an unusual time of incredibly cheap money in which bankers, regardless of quality, could make a killing. We have now entered a return to more normal rates, and something is going to break in the banking system. We've seen SVB say goodnight from us, a couple of the American regionals. And as the quality of earnings over the last few years come under public notice, I think there is a temptation to manage the risk of a bank's reputation by adopting faux or false models and operating them. And I think Nigel Farage, the attempt to expel Nigel Farage, is one of those particular virtue signaling areas. Des, did you want to?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt if you hadn't finished. It's, in my opinion, just my opinion, I think Nigel Farage is the toxic partner in all relationships, the one who has to have everybody else apologising to him, although they've done nothing wrong. As an aside, my other concern has always been now that the government talking about intervening to tighten the rules on offboarding people, which is, again, this has worked to Farage's benefit, because government have only recently held back on plans to crack down on buy now, pay later products, and not in the regulatory thing, which potentially affects people with problem debts, and stating that it would curb the availability of low interest products, when in reality those shoppers are landing themselves in mounting piles of unregulated debt. So I think he's kind of made it a little bit, it's worked to his favour at the moment. And remembering that Coutts is a private club and not a business or retail bank. That's one of the things, Coutts has a very great concierge service, probably get you Taylor Swift tickets or a seat at any sporting final in the world as well, which the retail and business banks don't yet. What's happening is we're seeing that the government are kind of, there's a lot out there at the moment talking about promising to tighten the rules and whatever, without thinking about the anti-money laundering regulations, the tipping off regulations, and all those other things. That's my thought. Sorry.
No, go for it. Because for me, I think Nigel Farage has been incredibly lucky in the timing of this. And I think part of it goes back to the way banks have been behaving over the last 2 or 3 years. Under the guise of de-risking, they're getting rid of marginal clients. And because in the UK there is no right to hold a bank account, that disappeared when TSB was privatised, what was the old Jaro Bank. And it's flashed up with a number of politicians, including the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, including Grant Shapps, who have had their families debanked. They've had relationships debanked. Grant Shapps was asked to produce 18 years of pay certificates. The banks are behaving like a 4-year-old child with a chocolate-covered live grenade. The result is inevitable. The question is where it is going to go bang. And it's gone bang at a time when parliamentary MPs are feeling very bruised and can easily identify with this poor quality, I can't emphasize enough, really poor quality risk review, which was done because Nigel, they considered, is a PEP. And in it, they claimed he's xenophobic, despite having had a German wife for over 30 years. The drivel that has come out of that Coutts assessment would mean that if I were responsible for HR, I would be looking at the quality of the training of everybody on that risk management committee, because to have let that through, because they did pick up, oh, this could get particularly nasty in a PR war. I don't think they realized they were nuking their own chief executive, both of the bank and the group. And it's worth bearing in mind that Dame Alison went, not because she debanked Nigel Farage, but she told the BBC a blatant untruth in order to justify it.
But it's even more than that, isn't it? What was she as a private banker? Private not meaning secret, despite how it is often interpreted. But as a private banker, what is she doing disclosing anything to do with a customer to the media? That is just absolutely outrageous, and she should be gone on that alone. Without anything else, she should be gone on that alone. And so should anybody else who was involved in that.
And that brings me to my very next thing. If we're truthful, if we really want to almost in Admiral Byng terms, which is a British admiral who was shot in 1756 for failing to defend Minorca, I think it was, fully and effectively, shot on his own boat for failing in his duties. The entire board of NatWest should go as well. In my mind, if we were serious about governance, gone. But we're
and
not.
all people on that risk committee, because their
Yes.
basis of decision making was so fundamentally flawed that it's getting close to dishonesty. It's not dishonest, but it's getting close to it. And it seems to me that the problem we're going to face is that if they do indeed go through training as you've suggested, what's going to happen is they're going to get a whole load of sensibility training, and they're not going to get training from people who say, you've really messed up here, and this is how you messed up, and this is what needs to be done to fix it. They need people who are going to be brutal and blunt, not people who are going to say, oh, well, we can fix it. There you go, pat, pat, pat.
Yes, I agree. But Julia, are we making your life any easier in this rant that I'm giving and my two colleagues are sensibly challenging?
I think, what I gather from here is that there is a lot of work that has to go in here. First is to start with equipping the team to be able to do proper risk assessment. So from what I understand is that the way that it was even written up is that no one has really thought through on the risk that this particular customer has posed to the bank. And the other thing is on the senior management level is to really give a lot of consideration to the overall impact on. I know that now we do have this reputational risk committee, which is quite common in the bank, but the way that it should be presented, we have got to also remember that whatever that we write one day is going to be published, and whatever that is going to be written there, we make sure that
in the minutes of that
factual.
meeting, in the minutes of that meeting, they did. One person, I believe, did highlight the fact that there could be an adverse impact for Coots themselves. They didn't assess that risk. It goes back to my point about always asking questions, if only to understand how they got to the decision. Asking a question isn't about justifying your reason. It's about being able to explain how you got to where you were on that journey, for me. And that's why I would always be continually asking those questions. In the retail business and banking world, and that you work in as well, Julia, a lot of these companies have under-resourced departments in their compliance teams. So onboarding new clients, it's if they become a risk-averse business and saying no to anything that looks like it may be hassle, rather than trying to manage that potential hassle and risk appetite, is just going against the whole process. And that's something that the way the media has been pursuing this for the last couple of weeks is suggesting that everybody should be going. That's a concern that I have. What do you think?
Yeah, that's for sure.
I do think that the bank has got a very major problem, but within NatWest Group for 20 years, 25 years, there has been a compliance problem. I have a friend, haven't seen him for a long time, who was in the compliance department in NatWest, and who left without another job to go to because he said, I cannot make these people do what I need them to do. And that was a quarter of a century ago. And I think if we go back to Des's earlier point, that decision-making is being driven by wokeism. It is not being driven by the reason the bank is there, which is to make money for its shareholders. That's what a bank is for. It's not a public service. It's not a PR exercise. It's not a newspaper. It's supposed to do one thing and one thing only, to make money for its shareholders. And as a byproduct of that, it makes money for its customers. I don't think there's enough people paying attention to that. I think there's far too many people saying, well, you're providing a service to somebody we don't like. It's politically disadvantageous, so you should get rid of him or her.
There are
So
two further
Let's
things
take 1 minute.
two further things I just want to add. One is, I think that the change of account relationship manager may have been crucial, because I think some of the counter arguments should have been put into that risk committee by the person responsible for the account. And it turns out they exited him as they had a change of front office manager. The other thing, much more controversial, is quality of journalism over the last 10, 12 years has fallen off the edge of a cliff. It's now partisan drivel, quite a lot of it, and that's what was quoted in the report, not effective risk assessment. Thank you and good night.
I think we can go to, we can look at this in another episode. We can look at the question of open source intelligence and its value or even relevance. And perhaps,
I think that's a good idea.
Perhaps, Julia, that should be a topic you put on your list for the next few weeks.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That the power of the fourth estate needs to be looked at. Definitely.
It's the fifth estate, isn't it? Twitter and everyone who thinks that because they've got a keyboard, they're a journalist and they are there to be the moral, what's the word I'm looking for?
Arbiter.
Yes, thank you, for society at large.
We all know that's my job.
Mine and Des's. And Julia, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, OCC.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure too.